Fermentation is anaerobic respiration. So anaerobic means without oxygen. If we recall that glucose is going to be broken down in the cytoplasm during the process of glycolysis, that's going to be broken down into pyruvic acid molecules. And that pyruvic acid would then go to the Krebs cycle if oxygen is present. And then eventually the products from glycolysis and the Krebs cycle will go to the electron transport chain. So what happens if oxygen is unavailable? Well, the process of fermentation is going to take place, and that's going to happen in the cytoplasm. And remember that fermentation is anaerobic respiration, which means that there is no oxygen being used in this process. Recall that glycolysis is going to be an anaerobic form to break down glucose. There's two types of fermentation, alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Let's first look at alcoholic fermentation. It involves taking the pyruvic acid from glycolysis plus NADH, and from there we're going to get alcohol, CO2, and NAD+. So in order for fermentation to take place, glycolysis has to happen first. If we go back to our slide, we see that glucose happens, we form the pyruvic acid, and then, depending if oxygen is present or not, it can take two pathways. So if oxygen is present, it's going to take the aerobic respiration route. If oxygen is unavailable, it's going to go the fermentation route. So we have to break down glucose into pyruvic acid to start with. So back to alcoholic fermentation. We take that pyruvic acid and we have our NADH, remember, which is electron rich, and then from there, we're going to form alcohol and CO2, which are actually waste, but we use them to our benefit. And then NAD+, which is going to be an electron acceptor. So it can pick up more electrons and then be used again. So organisms use this to create energy. This is yeast, for example, and we've taken advantage of this in order to make things like beer, wine, bread, root beer, and that's because the yeast is going to go through this process and produce these waste products. The other form of fermentation is lactic acid fermentation. Same thing happens. So glycolysis occurs and there's no oxygen available. So that pyruvic acid is going to be broken down into lactic acid, carbon dioxide, and we're going to take the NADH, because we're using those electrons, it then becomes an electron acceptor again to go back and pick up more electrons. So organisms that use this are bacteria and even us in our muscle cells, because what happens is if we're undergoing intense activity and we're using energy and we're not making it, we're making energy, we're using energy, and we're not getting enough oxygen to the cells are forced to still form ATP, but they're going to have to use fermentation. And they undergo lactic acid fermentation. And what happens is that lactic acid is actually going to build up in the muscles, and it's what causes cramping. Um, then eventually, as more oxygen is made available to the cells and they start going through aerobic respiration, it will start to clear the lactic acid and the cramping subsides. Lactic acid and carbon dioxide are also used to make things like cheese, okay, vinegar, yogurts, and those are from bacteria. Okay, so the bacteria undergo this process and then we benefit from the waste products, the lactic acid and the carbon dioxide. So lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation are the two types of fermentation that can occur. And we actually undergo in our cells lactic acid fermentation if oxygen is not available. And remember that other organisms are actually using this to produce ATP, but the net gain of ATP is much, much smaller than if we were to undergo aerobic cellular respiration.